new psychological study from the National Institute of Mental Health.
Just this morning, along with his longtime psychiatrist.
The circle of depression is growing wider, broader.
15% of women suffer from this disorder.
Affecting over 20 million Americans.
Changes that have occurred in the brain.
Abnormalities in the neurotransmitters.
Is that a chemical imbalance?
You've got a problem, they've got a drug.
8 million American kids take prescribed medication.
Children need psychiatric care.
But what if the criminal is mentally ill?
It's a punishment, a form of aversion therapy.
10-minute cures on the show, but I want to...
Seasonal affective disorder.
OCD.
Oppositional defiant disorder.
Schools criticized for over-prescribing.
Para onde quer que olhe, aí está. Pensa que a psiquiatria não tem nada a ver consigo? Pense de novo. Todo o campo da psiquiatria entrou em cada faceta da sua vida.
They basically believe that everyone is mentally ill.
You smoke too much, it's a disease. You're too unhappy, it's a disease. You're too thin, it's a disease. You're too fat, it's a disease.
Where are these coming from? These are coming from the minds of psychiatrists that are dreaming these things up, writing papers and getting published with their names on it, creating these new diseases.
First he said that I had ADD. Then he said that I was depressed. Then he said I might be bipolar, but I don't have ADD anymore.
And he said, you know, I've been noticing you, and I wonder if you have it too.
What they decided is that both my husband and my son had a chemical imbalance that needed to be corrected with a chemical balancer.
There is not one shred of credible evidence that any respectable scientist would consider valid, demonstrating that anything that psychiatrists call mental illness are brain diseases or biochemical imbalances. It's all fraud.
There's no reliability of diagnosis, and there is no science. It's just pseudoscience. It's pretend science.
This is one of the most open secrets in all of America in the psychiatric field, that nothing is being done that's legitimate, and they're billing for it.
Os psiquiatras afirmam que há mais de 1.000 milhões de pessoas com doenças mentais. Nos últimos 35 anos, o número de pessoas a tomar drogas psiquiátricas triplicou para mais de 120 milhões de consumidores atualmente. E agora drogam 20 milhões de crianças em idade escolar com estimulantes e outras drogas psicotrópicas. Quando foram interrogados sobre a sua base científica, aqueles psiquiatras dispostos a serem entrevistados só deram desculpas.
Psychiatric illness is not really illness.
How do you evaluate if someone is cured or sick?
Cure is certainly something we look forward to. We had no earthly idea how to accomplish.
We're not good at causes. We don't know what causes mental illness.
Mas isso não os impede de dizerem que são os peritos da saúde mental e tratarem as pessoas contra a sua vontade. E os resultados são autoevidentes.
This psychiatrist, man who's supposed to work to heal people, has done nothing but destroy this man's life, and in destroying his life, destroying the lives of all of his loved ones. Excuse me.
They've damaged and ruined my son, and they've trapped him in a system.
The way that they treated him and made him feel like he was worthless.
Bryant was being kept dumb and high on Ritalin so that they could make $2,500 per month.
He gave me Valium, and I got addicted to it.
It wiped out my life.
My life has been ruined. My joy has been stolen.
She was lying there. She took two gasps of air and died right there in front of me.
It is really tragic. It's awful. And it's being done for money. That's why it's being done.
Oh, it's got to be in the billions. I don't know the exact number, but it's got to be in the billions. It's just unbelievable.
This is so big that it boggles the mind.
Pegue na tragédia humana que viu e multiplique-a por milhões. Desde 1965, quase o dobro de estadunidenses morreram nos hospitais psiquiátricos do que os soldados dos Estados Unidos mortos em combate desde 1775. Nos Estados Unidos, as seguradoras estatais e privadas pagam 100 mil milhões de dólares por ano por serviços psiquiátricos, aumentando o custo dos seguros de saúde. E enquanto embolsam 1/3 de $1 bilhão por ano, a psiquiatria não consegue mostrar uma única cura. Difícil de acreditar? Isso é o que eles pretendem. E como lhe iremos mostrar, é assim que eles têm conseguido escapar desde o início.
The roots of psychiatry have to do with control, power, and alienation from certain groups of people who were uncomfortable to be around. They were locked up in these places to get them out of the way. The history of psychiatry, I think, really is related to institutions.
O Hospital Real Bethlehem de Londres foi uma das primeiras instituições psiquiátricas do mundo. Chamado normalmente Bedlam, o hospital era um armazém para aqueles que eram considerados malucos. Os internados eram confinados em jaulas, armários e estábulos de animais, acorrentados a paredes e chicoteados, enquanto o hospício cobrava entradas para exibição pública. No século XVIII, William Batty foi o primeiro a promover que as suas instituições podiam curar os doentes mentais. Os hospícios de Batty tornaram-no num dos homens mais ricos de Inglaterra, embora os seus tratamentos fossem tão desumanos como os de Bedlam, sem um único paciente curado. O seu sucesso financeiro expandiu o negócio dos hospícios e uma oportunidade para os psiquiatras lucrarem com esta indústria crescente.
This was an era where, on both sides of the Atlantic, specialized institutions for the mentally ill are beginning to be built in large numbers. Those institutions date back certainly to the beginning of the 18th century, and in a few cases even earlier than that. But the explosive growth of an asylum sector, of asylumdom, as some historians have called it, is very much a 19th century phenomenon. It's that period when the state is persuaded to invest tax dollars in building these places.
Embora aqueles que dirigiam as instituições enriquecessem, faltava ainda credibilidade aos psiquiatras para aumentarem o seu fluxo de dinheiro.
In order to justify their profession, they needed to come up with these biological solutions, or they didn't have any profession. The only way for them to solve that was to attempt to start believing that these people that were suffering from emotional disorders was from a biological basis.
Whatever was done to make this person more manageable would be simply called a treatment. And the sad reality is that many of these so-called treatments were, in essence, torture.
The near-drowning devices that were developed in this period, for example, must have been appallingly frightening. For example, one device involved putting the patient into a coffin, closing the lid, and dumping it into a bath of water, and then opening it up and trying to revive the patient. There were a range of these things, and the mortality rate was very, very high.
Os psiquiatras procuraram dar credibilidade às suas práticas ao mascará-las sob a linguagem da medicina. Assim, cada abordagem experimental imprudente que testavam era tida como um modelo médico.
Somebody who's really hyper and manic, if you're wrapped up in a cold sheet and dunked into some water, you're going to quit acting manic because that's a punishing treatment. So, but as soon as the symptoms started to go away, they started to believe that somehow by wrapping them up and dunking them in cold water, it was draining the toxics out of their body. So they built the medical model around that.
Ao levar a teoria biológica da doença mental adiante, um estadunidense, Benjamin Rush, apresentou a ideia de que a insanidade era causada por demasiado sangue na cabeça. A cura era retirar o sangue por quaisquer meios possíveis. Com tensão física, água fria, sangramento e até terror. E com isso, um novo modelo médico foi criado.
Benjamin Rush was probably the most famous American physician of the Revolutionary era. Rush was known as the master bleeder. He bled his patients for madness. He also invented something called the tranquilizer. It's a chair that looks a little bit like an electric chair. The patient was confined in this apparatus, sometimes with cold water applied to his or her head, for some hours at a time, and Rush announces in a letter that he's invented this new contraption and dubbed it the tranquilizer.
Rush detalhou os seus procedimentos frequentemente letais no seu livro de 1812, que permaneceu como a fonte de autoridade da psiquiatria nos 70 anos seguintes. Ele era tão venerado que em 1965 Rush foi consagrado pai da psiquiatria americana no brasão da Associação Americana de Psiquiatria. À medida que o século XIX passava, os fracassos contínuos da psiquiatria na cura da loucura ameaçavam os seus lucros, o que a forçou a criar novos modelos médicos.
The cures promised were not delivered. So by the 1860s and 70s, a growing mood of pessimism was covering Europe and North America, that effectively the new institutions were ever growing in size, but not growing in their effectiveness.
O século XX trouxe mais modelos médicos. O psiquiatra estadunidense Henry Cotton mutilava os seus doentes extraindo partes dos seus corpos e declarava que isto era um avanço no tratamento da doença mental.
The earliest target was the teeth and then the tonsils and the sinuses, but when patients didn't get better, the enthusiasts for this treatment then started to move down the body and to say, well, obviously patients have swallowed bacteria in their saliva, so stomachs need to go, spleens need to go, colons need to go.
Conforme os protestos públicos sobre tortura e mutilação cresciam, os psiquiatras inventavam novos métodos, cada um aclamado como a cura milagrosa. Mas nenhuma delas provou ser mais eficaz ou menos brutal do que a anterior.
This is a history of psychiatry, more or less, to damage the patient. I mean, this is a version of the original model, which was to chain them like animals.
If you're doing it to somebody because you insist that they have to change, and you're going to do that by turning the screws, you might say, whether it's with medication, restraint, whatever, that's torture. And a huge part of what psychiatry has done really comes down to torture.
À medida que o século XX passava, a psiquiatria continuava a procurar legitimidade por meio de se transformar numa disciplina médica. Mas só conseguiram criar meios mais eficientes de infligir tortura mental e física e morte. Um legado que foi levado adiante pela psiquiatria moderna com o seu modelo médico mais lucrativo até à data: a medicação de milhões. Mas para o fazer, tinham de destruir uma das crenças mais preciosas da humanidade, decretando que as pessoas não eram o que pensavam que eram. Universidade de Leipzig, Alemanha, 1879. O professor Wilhelm Wundt faz experiências sobre os sentidos humanos. Wundt diz que os pensamentos, personalidade e comportamentos do homem não são mais do que reações químicas no cérebro.
Wundt became frustrated with his inability to change behavior because he was dealing with the original, psychology. That's the psyche, that's the soul. He created a new science, which was based on man being an animal without a soul, to be trained. Not to be a thinker, but to be trained.
Estudantes de todo o mundo reuniram-se para estudar a nova definição que Wundt tinha para o homem, um organismo sem alma. O pensamento da época foi resumido pelo filósofo alemão Friedrich Nietzsche.
Gott ist tot. Gott bleibt tot. Und wir haben ihn getötet.
Seguindo a teoria de Wundt, um russo, Ivan Pavlov, fez experiências em animais procurando formas para mudar o comportamento.
Pavlov studied Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany, in the late 1800s. And he experimented with dogs with electrodes and stimulus response, denying privileges to denying rewards.
And he noticed that when you brought out some food in front of animals, dogs in particular, that they would begin to salivate. So he'd ring the bell at the same time that he brought the food out, and then eventually, instead of bringing the food out, he just rang the bell, and of course the dogs got all excited. He called that a conditioned reflex.
As primeiras cobaias humanas foram as crianças. Ele abriu buracos nas suas bochechas para recolher e medir a saliva.
Pavlovian conditioning became one of the major foundations of a lot of behavioral science research in the 20th century.
A ideia do comportamento ser controlado pelo condicionamento repetitivo ficou conhecida como behaviorismo.
The behaviorists believed that all children are animals and can be trained as animals. This was the view of behaviorists. As a matter of fact, John Watson, the most famous of the behaviorists, says that you have to treat human beings or look at human beings the way you would look at the ox you slaughter. See, the behavior is not interested in what's up in your head or your soul because they don't believe there is a soul.
O sucessor de Watson, B.F. Skinner, de Harvard, acreditava que o comportamento podia ser manipulado para servir os fins que o psicólogo behaviorista procurava.
Skinner developed what's called operant conditioning, where he was able to demonstrate you can change animal behavior by certain schedules of reinforcement, by giving them rewards at certain times, and then you can teach pigeons to play ping pong, for example, and you can teach rats to run mazes, and you can teach human beings to seek certain economic or societal rewards.
Skinner could actually shape new behavior patterns, and this actually was the sort of thing he quite soon became very famous for.
Talvez a sua experiência mais notória tenha sido a caixa de Skinner.
He was designing a Skinner box, which is something like a big playpen, but everything in it's controlled. The temperature's controlled, the light's controlled, and so on. And the idea is then you present children with certain stimuli that you want them to learn to react to.
Skinner isolou a sua filha durante ano, numa caixa similar às que construiu para os ratos.
The child was stimulated and had to respond in a certain way, like a chicken or a rat in a cage, because they firmly believe that children are animals. If you believe, though, that a child is a human being, you can't train him like a rat.
Hoje, cerca de 40 milhões anuais do dinheiro dos contribuintes é pago pelo Instituto Nacional de Saúde Mental dos Estados Unidos para a investigação behaviorista. Um total de 20 mil milhões de dólares para toda a pesquisa desde 1948. Com esses fundos, os psiquiatras usam as mesmas técnicas de condicionamento desenvolvidas por Pavlov, Watson e Skinner. Por exemplo, um centro de detenção juvenil onde as crianças estão ligadas a baterias com uma capacidade até 270 volts e recebem choques, num procedimento chamado terapia de aversão.
Antoine was having a number of problems because he was up at a center that was shocking him every time he did anything. There was a button on a little, almost like a TV remote, that would be used and pushed.
They will get an additional shock for trying to remove the electrode. So they're expected to sit there and let this electricity pass through their skin without trying to remove it. If they yell in anticipation of the shock, they will shock the student an additional time for yell.
The cost to send a student to Judge Rottenberg from New York is about $214,000 per student. These students are tortured. They're given this electric shock therapy for no other reason but to inflict pain.
Outras técnicas são a administração de eletrochoques para tratar pervertidos sexuais, enviando impulsos magnéticos pelo crânio para interromper atividades cerebrais e disparando alta voltagem através de elétrodos implantados para suprimir o comportamento problemático, e isto custa até $100 mil por paciente. Enquanto esta ciência sem alma levou a técnicas de mudança de comportamento que continuam a gerar $1.000 milhões em pesquisa e tratamento, também preparou o terreno para outro movimento psiquiátrico que causaria as mortes de milhões de pessoas.
January 1945. As World War II comes to a close, the full horror of Hitler's final solution is exposed, with grotesque killing factories unparalleled in human history, Mass graves filled with corpses of men, women and children, murdered by starvation, bullets and poison gas. What could drive men to commit such atrocities against their fellow human beings?
A resposta é a pseudociência chamada eugenia, criada e promovida por psiquiatras e psicólogos décadas antes dos nazis chegarem ao poder.
The eugenics movement got started in 1883 with Francis Galton, and he felt that human beings should take evolution in their own hands, and that the most talented individuals, the most healthy individuals, the most attractive individuals should have more offspring.
There was great concern that people that they considered had poor genes were reproducing faster than the people they considered had good genes.
They felt that a medical solution might be the proper one. This is what led to the sterilization movement.
It resulted in sterilization of mentally ill people, sterilization of retarded people, sterilization of people we don't like politically and sociologically. So the problem is not with genetics. The problem is a pretend phony genetics used to justify inhumane social policies.
Embora nunca se provasse que isto não passava de teoria, no início do século XX a eugenia espalhou-se a quase 30 países, desde a Inglaterra ao Brasil, México, Suécia, Rússia e, em particular, os Estados Unidos, onde a esterilização forçada era amplamente praticada.
Eugenics movement in Germany was somewhat different than the eugenics movement in the United States in that there were many more physicians and psychiatrists. Alfred Plutz was one of the pioneers in the German eugenics movement and how to control the population of those whom he considered inferior. In 1905, along with his brother-in-law, Ernst Rudin, he established the first organization for racial hygiene.
Alle Völker müssen eine außerordentlich große Zahl von minderwertigen Schwächlinge, Kränkliche und Krüppel mit sich schleppen. Durch eine weise Gesetzgebung in diese Richtung wird auch zugleich in rationellster Weise die erforderliche Zuchtwahl getrieben werden können.
Hitler estava muito impressionado pelo eugenista Madison Grant. O livro de Grant, O Fim da Grande Raça, foi proclamado por Hitler como sendo a sua bíblia pessoal. No seu livro A Minha Luta, Hitler aclamava a eugenia como a ciência que reconstruiria a nação alemã.
Wer körperlich und geistig nicht gesund und würdig ist, darf sein Leid nicht im Körper seines Kindes verewigen. Das Recht der persönlichen Freiheit tritt zurück gegenüber der Pflicht der Erhaltung der Rasse.
The German eugenicists welcomed the Nazi advent to power because the Nazi program could fund the very programs that they had in mind. The Nazis gave them political support, financial support, and conversely, the psychiatrists gave the Nazis a medical justification for their genocidal policies.
Something like 40% of German psychiatrists had joined the SS by 1933. They weren't forced into the SS, they just joined it naturally, because the beliefs were very, very similar.
Rudin and his work led directly to the decision to move from sterilization to murder.
O plano era simples. Primeiro, convencer o público de que os débeis mentais indesejáveis queriam escapar ao fardo da sua existência, mas não o conseguiam dizer, e que os matar era um ato de misericórdia. Depois ampliar a definição de inferior para incluir as testemunhas de Jeová, judeus, ciganos, homossexuais, todos não merecedores da vida. Os psiquiatras produziam filmes conhecidos como filmes de extermínio, exibidos em 5.300 cinemas espalhados pela Alemanha.
Geisteskrankheit ist als ein Erbübel eine der größten Gefahren für die Volksgesundheit. Irrtum ist, dass sich solche Kranken glücklich fühlen und am Leben hängen. Sie haben überhaupt kein Daseinsbewusstsein. Wer von ihr befallen wird, dem ist die schwerste Last des Schicksals auferlegt. Ein Dasein ohne Leben.
It first started with passive violence, which is starvation,
It then intensified to lethal injections, and finally it developed into systematic gassing and cremation.
A sua sede foi estabelecida em Berlim com o infame nome de código T4.
T4 program was named after Tiergarten 4, which essentially resulted over a period of time in the murder of about 70,000 people who were deemed mentally retarded, emotionally distraught, or physically handicapped by the Germans. They were called life unworthy of living.
O assassínio foi experimentado em hospitais psiquiátricos alemães, depois foi levado para os campos de concentração, onde os psiquiatras alemães mais importantes eram carrascos. Paul Nietzsche, o diretor do T4, declarou:
Die Durchkämmung der KZs fand nach genau denselben Gesichtspunkten anhand derselben Meldebögen statt wie die der Irrenhäuser.
6 million Jews died in concentration camps and as a result of Nazi extermination policies. Rudin congratulated Hitler for making his, that is Rudin's, 30-year dream come true.
Após a rendição nazi, houve um Tribunal Internacional de Justiça para julgar médicos e psiquiatras pelos seus crimes de guerra. Mas os psiquiatras estadunidenses, receando o futuro da psiquiatria, intervieram por meio de culparem uns quantos psiquiatras alemães.
There were some doctors who were prosecuted, but very few. Ernst Rudin returned to Switzerland at the end of the war. He did not serve any prison time.
One of the strangest things of all about the legacy of Nazi science is that some of the nastiest psychiatric eugenicists at the end of the war went back to work either in Germany or sometimes in the United States.
Só depois de 1999 é que a Associação de Psiquiatria, Psicoterapia e Neurologia Alemã por fim admitiu que os psiquiatras não foram apenas primariamente responsáveis pela ciência por detrás dos programas de eutanásia nazis, mas também pela orientação e direção das campanhas de assassínio. Em 2010, o seu novo presidente admitiu novamente, adicionando que aqueles psiquiatras tinham continuado os seus assassínios em massa, mesmo depois que o programa T4 tinha parado oficialmente. Mas isso teve um atraso muito grande, de 70 anos. O que começou com um plano psiquiátrico para eliminar os humanos indesejáveis, acabou espalhado pelo mundo civilizado e foi responsável pelo extermínio de 11 milhões de pessoas. Nunca levados à justiça, os psiquiatras, como verá, continuaram a promover a eugenia por todo o mundo. E hoje vemos os resultados. No racismo, na miséria humana e nos conflitos sociais intermináveis.
After World War II, a new eugenics was resurrected out of the bones and ashes of the old eugenics. The eugenics movement has been at the forefront to establish a new scientific racism that justifies oppression and exploitation and racism.
De facto, o racismo é inseparável das raízes da psiquiatria.
The entire history of psychiatry, beginning with scientific conclusions that were made in the 1830s, was an effort to prove the intellectual inferiority of African Americans.
Benjamin Rush is the father of modern psychiatry, and he is the one that gave us the term nigritude. He said that all blacks have inherited this disease, and this particular disease, it caused them to be inferior. In addition to that, it was the reason why it was very important that blacks remained segregated and separate from whites so that whites did not inherit this disease.
Ao declarar que a negritude era uma forma de lepra, Rush justificou a segregação como uma necessidade médica. Isso tornou-se um argumento para continuar a escravatura.
The fact that you have brutalized a whole group of people had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with some genetic link and that basically you were just a diseased person, so when a slave master wanted to get rid of a recalcitrant slave, they could just say, oh, well, they're suffering from this disease.
Drapetomania, that is the name of the mental disorder that was contrived by Samuel Cartwright, who said that blacks have a mental disorder if they had a desire to run away from slavery.
Running away became such a common problem that psychiatrists attempted to give that a disease. He says, but that's a cure for that. And the question was, well, what's the cure for that? Frequent whippings, frequent whippings. You'd be surprised how that disease clears up when the lash is put in place of their excuses.
Após a abolição da escravatura, o racismo psiquiátrico persistiu e intensificou-se. O American Journal of Psychiatry declarou oficialmente que os negros, descendentes de selvagens e canibais, não estavam prontos para a civilização. Ao mesmo tempo, a sua pseudociência, eugenia, aumentava as suas atividades racistas.
There is a clear and long and intimate connection between the eugenics movement and the Ku Klux Klan. Harry Laughlin, who was the Carnegie Institution's director of the Eugenics Record Office, had a close relationship to the Ku Klux Klan through the publication of a book called White America, which was written by a major Klan leader. So Laughlin wrote a glowing review of the book in the Eugenics News. And at the same time, you have the Ku Klux Klan using eugenics to justify their racist goals.
Mas o racismo psiquiátrico não era exclusivamente americano. Alguns dos piores abusos do século XX ocorreram na África do Sul, onde o governo adotou as mesmas teorias e práticas racistas usadas por Hitler. Isto não foi coincidência. O primeiro-ministro estudou eugenia como aluno de psicologia na Alemanha, influenciada pelo nazismo da década de 1920.
Dr. Henrik Verwoerd is regarded as the architect of apartheid. He saw South Africa as a divided state with whites, blacks and brown people living in totally separate areas, with black people having no rights whatsoever.
Com a apartheid em vigor, os psiquiatras criaram hospitais psiquiátricos pelo país que não passavam de campos de trabalho escravo.
These places operated under a private company by the name of Smith, Mitchell and Company. They were saving money through the cheap accommodation for psychiatric patients while making massive fortune out of money that Parliament had appropriated for medication. So it was a corrupt system.
Quando esta operação foi finalmente exposta, descobriu-se que 22 mil pacientes tinham morrido, enquanto os campos psiquiátricos faziam um lucro de 90 milhões de dólares. A Organização Mundial de Saúde publicou um relatório declarando que a psiquiatria cultivava o racismo e os seus campos equivaliam à posse e comercialização de escravos. Durante os protestos pelos direitos civis de 1960, nos Estados Unidos, os psiquiatras continuaram o seu legado de racismo, alegando que o ativismo negro causava sintomas de esquizofrenia violenta, como delusões, manias de grandeza e sentimentos agressivos perigosos. Em 1972, o psiquiatra estadunidense Louis Jolly West foi mais longe. Tramou uma experiência secreta de terapia de aversão chamada Centro de Violência. O seu plano, financiado pelo governo, era implantar elétrodos nos cérebros de homens afro-americanos e hispânicos que lhes davam choques se exibissem comportamento violento. E se isso não funcionasse, usavam drogas para castrá-los. Quando a indignação pública se opôs à proposta racista do West, o plano foi abandonado. Embora as teorias racistas implacáveis da psiquiatria estivessem enfraquecidas, elas não foram paradas. Em 1994, o psicólogo Richard Herrnstein foi o co-autor de The Bell Curve, a curva do sino, que alega que os negros eram incapazes geneticamente e inferiores aos brancos.
The Bell Curve really argues a very old eugenics idea. It argues that people are born with different kinds of intellectual abilities, that these are inborn pretty much at birth. It goes back to the notion that somehow black people are genetically and biologically inferior to white people as a way to justify what was really its programs of social racism and social sexism. And you see that kind of thinking going on in public school testing and IQ testing and educational testing and tracking.
And this new tool fit into that old mold. It was a new tool that could prove the intellectual inferiority of African Americans.
Psychiatric profession has done great damage, certainly in the past, and far too many in the present too, to subvert democracy and perpetuate racial stereotypes, even more, deep racism in society.
We have to battle against this continual misinformation, disinformation, pseudoscience. It can be repackaged in whatever form or format it is. But if it is based solely upon the color of one's skin, it then is the merit of that human being I just reject.
E assim, hoje em dia, a chama do ódio continua a arder, agitada por mentiras pseudocientíficas. Esta é a herança da psiquiatria, uma justificação para o racismo e um pretexto para a repressão política.
Быть верными коммунистическим идеалам, убежденно, с революционной настойчивостью претворять в жизнь ленинский завет, учиться коммунизму, трудиться самоотверженно, по-коммунистически, всей жизнью своей, утверждать на земле дело Ленина, дело партии. Ленемся!
O regime soviético exigia lealdade absoluta. Os que não seguiam as regras eram considerados dissidentes e rotulados como inimigos do Estado. Com apenas um sussurro à polícia secreta, eles desapareciam para um dos hospitais psiquiátricos especiais. Apesar dos riscos, esses supostos dissidentes puseram as suas ideias de liberdade em ação.
Я вел жизнь тайную, конспиративную. Никто не знал, что я это делаю. У меня была маленькая подпольная типография. И я стал делать листовки.
Enquanto outros se consideravam cidadãos soviéticos leais.
Я, например, считал, и то уверенно считал, что я один из лучших советских людей. Когда уже даже меня арестовали и написали особо опасный государственный преступ, я рассмеялся. Я при нем, при этом же самом нынешнем генерале, рассмеялся. А он меня вызывает psiquiatra na outra.
De acordo com os psiquiatras soviéticos, eles sofriam de inflexibilidade de convicções, um sintoma de um novo transtorno. Esquizofrenia vagarosa.
Вот когда добьешься, тогда я заеду. Так, до конца пей.
Я буду с ним. Ребята, не заставьте его.
Давай пей, брат.
Como os seus homólogos noutros países, os psiquiatras soviéticos prescreviam drogas potentes para curar os seus pacientes.
Они никогда их с удовольствием не принимали. И находят пути их не принимать. Мы обязаны просмотреть прием лекарственных продуктов, чтобы больные лекарства дошли до больного. Вот они где-то, как говорится, в горле проглатывают, все, ротовая полость чистая. И потом такие делают какие-то движения, отрыгивают.
Врач на обходе говорит: как себя чувствуете, Петр Петрович? Я говорю: послушайте, вот, а там, когда 5 кубиков галоперидола, то надо, например, слюна до полу. Там перекошенность вся, значит, одни мышцы растягиваются, другие сокращаются. Совершенно ужасные позы, лицо все ужасное. На душе страшно просто. Я человека, вот самое главное, описать это состояние невозможно.
Санитары совершенно безнаказанно могли избивать. По любому поводу. Или вообще без повода. Вот, например, санитар открывает дверь, и вдруг, если тут ты оказался, например, в проеме двери. И вот этого достаточно было, чтобы, скажем, получить удар. Если больной, скажем, оказывал сопротивление при избиении, то Его могли привязать, и привязывали, и уже избивали, и продолжали избивать уже привязанного.
Проходит, допустим, год-два, там выписывают убийц, выписывают насильников. Михаил, ты бы лучше убил бы кого-нибудь, мне бы легче было тебя отсюда вытолкнуть. Это было, вот, растало такое чувство безысходности.
De 1967 a 1987, o governo soviético prendeu mais de 2 milhões de pessoas, que por razões políticas foram diagnosticadas como sendo doentes mentais e foram forçadas a passar pelo tratamento psiquiátrico. Até hoje, a psiquiatria continua a ser a ferramenta de coação preferida dos governos mundiais.
What we learned is that in Gitmo or Guantanamo Bay, that we had teams of healthcare professionals called the biscuit teams, behavioral scientists, psychologists, working with the military to advise them on how far you could push a prisoner. There are abuses that have been documented around the world. We have healthcare professionals who have committed potentially acts of treason within their medical ethics. And there's nobody supervising that. There's nobody making them stand accountable to their medical ethics.
Mas os psiquiatras nunca reservaram a tortura física ou mental só para os prisioneiros políticos. Através da história, eles têm mudado a embalagem e têm-na vendido ao público como terapia. No início da década de 1920, os psiquiatras abraçaram um novo grupo de procedimentos que alegavam que funcionava por meio de causar danos ao cérebro.
Manfred Sackel had this notion that he could kill just the bad brain cells, that somehow we have good brain cells, we have bad brain cells. So if you give people enough insulin, you kill those bad brain cells, and if the person survived this epilepsy, they would be better off for it.
Apesar das convulsões severas e da taxa de 5% de mortalidade do choque de insulina, Sackel apontou para os pacientes em estado infantil e declarou que o seu tratamento era um sucesso. Os hospitais construíram alas de insulina e a terapia de coma tornou-se um grande negócio. Para não ficar para trás, Ladislaus von Maduna, da Hungria, acreditava que podia expulsar a doença mental induzindo convulsões prejudiciais ao cérebro com uma droga chamada metrazol.
He noticed his epileptics had no mental health problems, and his mental health patients, his psychiatric patients, seemed to have no epilepsy, and so he thought doing one would obviate the other.
The theory was that epilepsy and schizophrenia couldn't coexist in the same brain, and that if epilepsy was induced, that a seizure was caused, it would, quote, drive out the schizophrenia. There's no scientific basis for this whatsoever.
O metrazol era rápido e lucrativo. Numa manhã, um único psiquiatra podia dar choques químicos a 50 pacientes para estarem num estado dócil e maniável. Em 1939, o metrazol era tão popular entre os psiquiatras e a equipa que era usado em 70% dos hospitais estadunidenses e em quase todos os outros países do mundo. O sucesso financeiro da insulina e metrazol causou o desenvolvimento de um método ainda mais lucrativo de induzir convulsões cerebrais.
How is electric shock therapy done?
We use these electrodes. We place them on the patient's head like this, and then by means of this machine, we pass a controlled electric current through the brain, just for a fraction of a second. The patient doesn't feel it.
A história por detrás desta cura milagrosa começou no matadouro em Roma.
In Italy, in 1938, two Italian psychiatrists decided to observe that before slaughtering pigs, in order to make the pigs more docile, they would apply electrodes to their temples that were hooked up to wall current, and that this stunned the pigs, but it didn't kill them, and they could then slaughter them. Well, this gave them the encouragement to try inducing convulsions with electricity.
We would see teeth falling out, broken spines, bones knocked out of joint, broken bones, and people even getting internal organ damage from being restrained while they were having these uncontrolled writhing seizures, convulsions.
Many patients have been returned to their homes and jobs who might still be here if it were not for this helpful form of treatment.
Tendo vendido com sucesso o dano cerebral como uma cura, os psiquiatras procuraram meios mais precisos de atingir o cérebro. Este foi iniciado em 1848, quando uma explosão atirou uma vareta de aço à cabeça de um operário dos comboios de Vermont, Phineas Gage. Embora Gage tenha sobrevivido, a sua personalidade alterou-se totalmente. 70 anos depois, o neurologista português Egas Muniz tentava ter um resultado similar por meio de furar o crânio de um paciente e borrifar álcool puro para o cérebro, destruindo o tecido dos lobos frontais. Muniz chamou este novo procedimento uma lobotomia. O Dr. Walter J. Freeman tornar-se o praticante mais infame da lobotomia. Ele descobriu que poderia fazê-lo mais depressa sem ter de furar o cérebro.
There was no anesthesia, and he would just lift up the eye and stick nothing more than an ice pick right into the brain, right under the orbital bone, and then just rake the thing back and forth until he was satisfied that he had caused enough disruption of brain tissue, and then pull it out.
Freeman viajava pelo país no seu lobotomóvel, mutilando os cérebros dos seus pacientes em palco ou por vezes no próprio veículo.
And he would pull up and offer lobotomies to people, get referrals from the local doctors, or sometimes people didn't even go through doctors. They'd go right to the lobotomobile, and he would just do the brain-damaging procedure right there.
Quando os seus privilégios cirúrgicos foram revogados após a morte do seu último paciente na mesa de operação, Freeman fez ou supervisionou mais de 3.500 lobotomias. Mais de 25%, como ele mesmo admitiu, deixaram as suas vítimas num estado vegetativo.
They lobotomized 1 million people in the 40s and the 50s and beginning of the 60s until they came to the conclusion that this was a destructive treatment.
Embora as curas milagrosas fossem expostas como fraudes de danos cerebrais, os psiquiatras continuaram a inventar novas formas de psicocirurgia que se passam por avanços médicos.
I completely shudder from head to toe. And that's what I heard in my head when he drilled something in my brain.
Northwest, actually, of the centre hole.
I'm sorry I had to do that.
Yeah, why did you have to do that?
I went, oh, funny and all.
Did you?
My head all shook inside.
Oh dear.
Oh, my head shook inside.
Yes, all right.
Everything shook, the eyes, everything, my teeth.
Oh, that's wrong.
That was grievous bodily harm done to my brain. And nobody has the right anyway to play God with somebody's brain.
The whole operation took about 8.5 hours. And they kept me awake for every second of it. And I remember every second of it. And I still remember it to this day because I have this operation every day of my life. Whether I like it or not, I have it.
Os psiquiatras elogiam os benefícios da psicocirurgia, um tratamento que lhes dá um lucro de 3,1 milhões de dólares anualmente. Como a reputação da lobotomia estava manchada, os psiquiatras rapidamente atraíram a atenção pública ao eletrochoque. Rebatizando de eletroconvulsoterapia, agora dão aos pacientes anestesias para aplacar os seus gritos e agentes paralisantes para não se ver as contorções de agonia.
The main misconception that people have about ECT is that it's new and improved. The new and improved refers strictly to these cosmetic improvements because, in fact, they make it easier on the witnesses. The person isn't shaking all over the table. They're paralyzed now. It isn't new, it isn't improved, it is worse.
Every 10 years or so, there tends to be, first of all, a denial that it causes any harm. Secondly, an acknowledgement that it might have caused harm, but here's a whole new approach, and now this one is blameless, without any research to back it up.
The ECT machine can produce anywhere from 50 to 400 volts. It's the kind of energy that we use for industrial machinery that might be in a steel mill or a printing press, some large piece of machinery. It's an extraordinary amount of energy and it causes a great deal of damage.
Embora as histórias de prisioneiros maltratados com eletrochoques sejam bem publicitadas, a quantidade de eletricidade dada pelos psiquiatras com a ECT é até 33 vezes maior. E esse dano é frequentemente direcionado aos mais vulneráveis. 2/3 daqueles que recebem eletrochoques são mulheres diagnosticadas com síndrome pré-menstrual, transtorno da menopausa ou depressão pós-parto. Metade dos pacientes de eletrochoques são idosos. Quando se tornam elegíveis para cuidados de saúde aos 65 anos, o número de idosos americanos que recebem ECT é 2 vezes maior dos que os que têm 64 anos. Ao que é que isto tudo se resume? 100 mil mortos e incontáveis mais com tal dano cerebral que não têm esperança de recuperar uma vida normal. Por um total de $12 de eletricidade, os psiquiatras só nos Estados Unidos amealham 1,2 mil milhões de dólares. A próxima cura milagrosa dos psiquiatras, adicionada ao seu arsenal, deu-lhes mais dinheiro do que nunca, pois era mais rápida, mais barata e potencialmente podia fazer de homens, mulheres e crianças pacientes para toda a vida. No início da década de 1950, os psiquiatras descobriram a sua próxima cura milagrosa. Um químico originalmente criado para matar parasitas nos porcos, a nova descoberta prejudicava as funções cerebrais, tal como pôr um picador de gelo na cavidade ocular. Era um tratamento antigo, num novo disfarce.
With the advent of these new tranquilizing drugs, it seems not too much to say that we're on the verge of an entirely new era in the treatment of mental illness.
Chamando-lhe lobotomia química, o psiquiatra canadiano Heinz Lehmann descreveu a Thorazine como um comprimido fácil de tomar com os mesmos efeitos que a psicocirurgia, mas sem o sangue.
Thorazine provided psychiatry with the entry into mainstream medicine. It had its magic bullet. If I'm a psychiatrist and I have to spend an hour talking to someone in psychotherapy, there's only so much I can charge for that hour. But if I can come in, give you a pill, and send you back out in 15 minutes or 10 minutes, that's a much more efficient use of my time monetarily.
O que os psiquiatras não disseram ao público foi que a Thorazine causava a condição neurológica conhecida como discinésia tardia.
And that's a neurological syndrome where you have muscle twitches, abnormal jerks, which are uncontrolled, and they either last for a long time or sometimes they're permanent. So that's very clear, very well recognized long-term or permanent brain damage from these medications.
Mr. Blount has virtually no signs of his original illness now. The signs that the movements of his mouth are completely side effects of the drugs that he was on for 20 years. Mr. Blount is quite rational. He understands what's going on. And if you're patient, he can carry on a very rational conversation with you.
Even when you remove the drug, it may still remain. It means you have caused a permanent disabling of the brain. In the late 50s, you get the first signs of it, people starting to worry about it. But it's not until the late 70s that psychiatrists start warning their patients about it. 20 years.
O fabricante de Thorazine, SmithKline & French, tinha boas razões para encobrir as más notícias. Só no primeiro ano, a SKF teve um retorno superior a 500% sobre o investimento original. Sem expor ao público e à imprensa os efeitos secundários graves, médicos e psiquiatras encontraram-se em Porto Rico para preparar o terreno para a futura expansão das drogas psiquiátricas. O psiquiatra Dr. Nathan Klein escreveu o seguinte no relatório final da conferência.
The present breadth of drug use may be almost trivial when we compare it to the possible number of chemical substances that will be available for the control of selective aspects of man's life in the year 2000.
O Dr. Klein iniciou um movimento de encher o mercado global de psicotrópicos maravilhosos, apoiado por uma publicidade de centenas de milhões de dólares. A psiquiatria era agora uma indústria de traficantes de drogas. Em 1970, a Associação Americana de Psiquiatria dependia tanto do dinheiro dos laboratórios farmacêuticos que 30% do orçamento anual vinha dos anúncios farmacêuticos nas suas revistas oficiais.
So we had money flowing to trade organizations, we had money flowing to the doctors, and to their journals. Well, we all know that that is going to influence how they think.
The majority of National Institute of Mental Health and National Institute of Health scientists are getting more money from drug companies on the side than their tax-based salary.
Com tanto dinheiro a ser feito, os psiquiatras só precisavam de uma teoria científica para justificá-lo. A sua solução? Um relatório oficial declarando que os problemas mentais derivavam de um suposto desequilíbrio químico no cérebro que requeria drogas para ser corrigido.
This chemical imbalance is one of the greatest fallacies ever foisted upon patients and the public. There is no chemical test to show an imbalance related to any psychiatric disease, whether it's depression, anxiety, what have you.
The chemical imbalance is for the benefit of the psychiatrist. It has to be there so that psychiatrists can treat it.
Mas teorias falsas do desequilíbrio químico não escondiam a evidência crescente dos efeitos secundários comuns e aterradores, tais como a akathisia.
Akathisia is like an extreme inner nervous agitation. People describe it as wanting to crawl out of their own skins. And this happens with great frequency, and it is absolutely, totally well understood to be associated with suicide and violence and homicide.
Anos depois da informação destes efeitos secundários e destes casos de violência, automutilação e morte, em 1991, os peritos de saúde, legisladores e o público forçaram finalmente a FDA a ordenar uma investigação.
I know with absolute certainty that if Charles had any idea of the side effects of Prozac, he would never have taken it.
I had two sons, David Lee, age 8, Billy 16, wife 20 years old, gone. I'll tell you why. After being on Prozac for 21 days, my wife shot and killed both of these two boys right here. She turned the gun to herself and shot herself twice.
I took the 9mm automatic, sat down on the bed and put the gun to my head. And I blew a 4-inch hole out the back of my arm instead of my head. Thank God I was a lousy shot. Had someone looked further into Prozac, steps could have been taken to avoid it.
O que deveria ser uma audiência imparcial foi um painel de psiquiatras, a grande maioria com laços financeiros com os laboratórios farmacêuticos.
They basically couldn't find an expert, a doctor, a psychiatrist, at a leading medical school who basically in some way or another didn't have a consulting agreement, hadn't taken money from the pharmaceutical companies.
I do not find from the evidence today that there is credible evidence to support a conclusion that antidepressant drugs cause the emergence and or the intensification of suicidality and or other violent behaviors.
500 deaths, 33 murder cases, and over 20,000 adverse side effects. Would you like to tell me why this drug is still on the market?
Is there an alliance, an unholy alliance between the psychiatric community, the pharmaceutical industry, and the FDA? And the answer is yes.
Esta aliança profana tornou-se muito evidente em 1997, quando laboratórios farmacêuticos persuadiram a FDA a permitir-lhes fazer publicidade diretamente ao público. Com os psiquiatras a providenciarem avais médicos, em apenas 3 anos, as vendas de drogas psiquiátricas dispararam quase 2,5 vezes. Quando os números de violência e vítimas de suicídio cresceram demasiado, a indignação pública forçou a FDA a colocar avisos nos antidepressivos. Mas na altura, 13 anos passaram-se, $1.000 milhões tinham sido ganhos e os psiquiatras anunciavam os próximos psicotrópicos maravilhosos. Mais de 120 milhões da população mundial consomem psicotrópicos que são respaldados por uma ciência falsa e por reguladores que são pagos. Os seus medicamentos prejudiciais fazem perto de $84.000 milhões anuais. E enquanto os psiquiatras tentam achar um meio de diagnosticar e drogar todos no planeta, por outro lado, eles continuam o seu assalto às nossas liberdades pessoais. Os psiquiatras exigem o direito absoluto de determinar o que é melhor para os supostos doentes mentais. Afinal, os doentes mentais são malucos e incapazes de avaliar o seu tratamento. Para fazerem cumprir a sua autoridade e manterem as instituições num nível lucrativo, os psiquiatras usam um método chamado internamento compulsivo.
When you go to a real doctor, say a family doctor or a cardiologist, a patient always has the right to refuse treatment. So there is no such thing as involuntary treatment when it comes to clinical medicine as practiced by real doctors. Psychiatrists, of course, believe that people can be treated against their will.
Em 1956, o psiquiatra Winfred Overholzer apresentou um plano ao Congresso com a intenção de levar o internamento compulsivo a um novo nível. O plano era comprar 1 milhão de hectares no local ermo do Alasca, construir um hospício grande e mudar as leis de internamento para qualquer pessoa poder ser enviada sem mais do que uma indicação de um psiquiatra. O projeto de lei passou na Câmara dos Representantes, mas quando o público ouviu rumores do plano, eles enfureceram-se, referindo-se-lhe como Siberia USA. O projeto de lei foi cancelado no Senado. Embora o fim do projeto de lei Sibéria acabou com os seus planos em larga escala, o internamento compulsivo continuava a ser a forma mais eficaz e lucrativa para encher as instituições psiquiátricas.
Again, the person has committed no crime and has no trial and is sent directly to a mental hospital, which is really a prison.
How many people go to an insane asylum and say, please lock me up? Doctors don't lock up anybody. Psychiatrists lock you up.
Até as crianças podem ser tiradas dos seus pais com pouco direito a recursos legais.
They just invaded our home. They came in with officers. Our kids were scared. You know, they come in with pieces of paper and say, you're giving us your kids. And it's like, you know, how can they just come in and do that?
She said, you could be arrested for medical neglect. And I said, but how was that when, you know, this is my child? And I see that he doesn't need that much medication. Why would you threaten me with something like that?
At 10 p.m., 2 policemen and 2 social workers came to my house and took all 4 of my kids away.
Nos hospitais psiquiátricos, os pacientes são drogados e contidos fisicamente.
The more a person objects, the more this objection is construed as symptom of a mental illness.
At which point the person would be locked up in restraints. There would be the ankle, the knee, the waist, the head, the wrist, and the shoulder restraints. And if when that process was happening, if there was almost any resistance at all, the person then would be medicated to a point where they would almost be knocked out.
We had one case where they actually took a patient in a seclusion room and beat him up. And then they lied about it to the services that investigated. So it's a pretty wide range of abuse issues that we've encountered.
Os funcionários psiquiátricos incitam os pacientes à violência para faturarem às seguradoras até $400 por dia por paciente contido fisicamente.
A patient would resist diagnosis, resist treatment, and also want to leave treatment while they were at the hospital. And invariably, every time, that person's situation would be exacerbated until they were put in constraints and medicated, at which point there would be documented reasons to keep that person in treatment.
O fardo dessas alegações é repassado ao público por meio das cotas crescentes de planos de saúde. Quanto às suas vítimas, a experiência é traumática e até mesmo letal.
16-year-old Rochelle Claiborne died in Laurel Ridge's care last August. The state report shows during the restraint, quote, Rochelle stated several times she could not breathe.
In almost all respects, the staff behaved appropriately, followed the standards.
Devido às leis de contenção fracas ou vagas, os psiquiatras e funcionários raramente são responsabilizados legalmente por agressão e assassínio.
He begged me to take him home, take him out of there, that they were treating him wrongly, and he didn't want to stay there. And I got a call that there had been an accident, that they held him down until he couldn't breathe anymore. I wish I would have listened to him, take him out of there before it had happened. And then I miss him every day. And I wish I could have him back, but I can't.
Até hoje, ninguém foi responsabilizado pelo assassínio desta criança. Os idosos são o alvo primário do abuso psiquiátrico. E o tratamento de idosos em instituições mentais nos Estados Unidos custam às seguradoras privadas e do governo 4,5 mil milhões de dólares anuais.
Unwarranted commitment has occurred that wouldn't have occurred if the people hadn't had insurance. The proof of that pudding is generally in how fast they get out once the insurance runs out.
Involuntary commitment is a form of psychiatric slavery, where persons are treated as if they're property and they are deprived of liberty, and people are making money in the process.
As long as we have involuntary mental hospitalization, psychiatry is a prison work. It's a crime against humanity. It is not medicine.
A cada 40 segundos, uma pessoa é internada compulsivamente numa instituição psiquiátrica. Se pensa que é algo que não lhe pode acontecer ou alguém que conheça, pensa outra vez. Enquanto você via este capítulo, 10 pessoas foram internadas contra a sua vontade. Com centenas de milhares de milhões de dólares destinados aos hospitais internacionalmente desde 1975, os psiquiatras conquistaram um empreendimento comercial lucrativo, encobertos por uma interpretação duvidosa da lei. Mas frequentemente cometem crimes demasiado flagrantes para serem ignorados.
The FBI has raided the headquarters of one of the nation's largest operators of psychiatric hospitals.
Hundreds complained of overbilling, misdiagnosed conditions, and insurance fraud.
Investigators say they found more than 5,000 similar cases in all 50 states.
Psychiatrists clearly are getting rich.
Psychiatrists traded drugs for sex, filed false insurance claims, and exploited patients sexually.
We have uncovered some of the most elaborate, aggressive, creative, deceptive, immoral, and illegal schemes being used to fill empty hospital beds with insured and paying patients.
Todos os psiquiatras fazem um juramento de seguir uma conduta ética, de pôr o bem-estar do paciente acima de tudo. Mas de todas as disciplinas médicas, a psiquiatria tem o pior registro de fraude e abuso.
Psychiatry is almost a license to print money. If a doctor were clever enough, and many of them are, there's no reason that they couldn't make at least $500,000 a year fraudulently and get away with it in psychiatry.
I don't purport to have deposed every psychiatrist in Las Vegas. I can tell you for a fact I haven't. Maybe I've deposed half. And by and large, they were a dishonest, deceitful, lying bunch of people.
As suas práticas de faturação criminosa são tão predominantes que investigadores de seguros têm um calão para isso, a Seno da Califórnia e o aperto de mão de $100.
$100 handshake is when usually a patient is institutionalized. Psychiatrist, psychologist will visit that person, shake hands with them, say, hello, I'm Dr. So-and-so, I'm taking care of your problem here, and then leaves.
They might have 10 or 20 patients there. They bill an hour for each one, and they might be in the hospital for a total of 30 minutes. So 20 patients, 20 hours, and they'd send the bills off to Medicaid.
We see that most of the victims of recovered memory therapy were women who had excellent health insurance, whether it was government insurance or private insurance, because many insurance policies wouldn't pay for this kind of long-term nonsense. So those people were targeted because of the nature of the insurance that they had.
Todos os anos, a indústria psiquiátrica dos Estados Unidos defrauda seguradoras do governo e privadas em $5 mil milhões, usando todos os meios para enganar o público.
There were some advertisements, very seductive advertisements for people wanting to lose weight and were having problems losing weight. And they would be given, all expenses paid to go to a particular spa. But when they got to this spa and went in and signed in, it wasn't a spa, it was a psychiatric center. And then they couldn't get out.
What instead they received massive doses of mind-altering drugs, and they were kept for a lengthy period of time, and their insurance carrier was billed tremendous amounts of money for something that was unnecessary.
Mas as mentiras vão além das suas alas psiquiátricas e chegam aos tribunais, onde, como testemunhas, dirão qualquer coisa por dinheiro.
A psychiatric expert who will have one opinion in one scenario and a completely opposite opinion in another scenario based on which law firm or governmental agency is paying for his time.
These psychiatrists, on one hand, will tell the public that suicide can be prevented, but will go into court and tell a jury that suicide cannot be prevented. And then once you show his prior inconsistent statements, you also show that he is paid very well by pharmaceuticals, then the jury says, you know what, we're not so sure about you because you just lied to us.
Adiciona à sua ganância, desonestidade e enganação os seus crimes sexuais. Estudos contemporâneos mostraram que pelo menos 10% dos psiquiatras cometeram crimes sexuais contra os seus pacientes.
It has happened so often that by the mid-80s, the insurance companies who insure physicians across America started writing sexual claims out of the policies altogether. That's how common it was.
The system was so broken that more than 25,000 complaints had been registered, but nothing acted upon. When a psychiatrist has a patient, a female patient, and abuses them sexually, there's a very high probability they'll get away with it.
I've seen many cases where the mental health professional becomes very disturbed and is using very strange and odd treatments, and that can go on for many years with no one finding out about it because it's not very public. It's quite private. Things happen behind closed doors.
Infelizmente, os seus crimes sexuais envolvem crianças. Por exemplo, o Dr. C. Markham Berry, um membro respeitado desta comunidade. Mas tudo acabou quando foi preso por acusação de assédio infantil. Quantidades de pornografia infantil foram retiradas da sua casa. Ao investigar-se, descobriu-se que ele abusou sexualmente de ex-pacientes, meninos entre os 7 e os 17 anos, que ele fotografou e sodomizou. Tudo parte do que o Estado chamou 50 anos de abusos sexuais infantis não detectados cometidos por Berry. Este não é um incidente isolado. É o caráter disfarçado dos membros desta profissão. Em todos os países do mundo encontrará psiquiatras a cometer violação, abuso sexual, assassínio e fraude. E como verá, a credibilidade total da psiquiatria depende da maior fraude de todas.
I was diagnosed with a chemical imbalance, manic depression.
They diagnosed me with having ADD.
He told me I had conduct disorder,
ADHD,
mild depression,
Major depression.
manic depressive,
Borderline personality disorder.
social anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia, depression,
sleep disorder, identity problem disorder.
And all of these so-called diseases are just made up. They're just fabricated. They're fictions of psychiatry imagination.
What would psychiatrists do without their labels? They couldn't pretend to be real doctors anymore, you know? Neither could psychologists, you know? Diagnosing, what a godlike thing to do. Making diagnoses, and here's your treatment, a pill.
Because so far they're not proving that any so-called mental illnesses exist. These are labels, and that's all they are.
Mas sem prova, não se tem credibilidade. Então a psiquiatria cria a sua.
It's based on a grab bag of checklists for disorders that are published in a book called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There are no statistics in this book, by the way. That just makes it sound more scientific.
They create this cluster of disease, and they get together and they vote. Is this a disease? All in favor, say aye.
The American Psychiatric Association is the publisher and owner and wealthy owner of DSM. They've made a great deal of money on DSM.
Desde a primeira edição do DSM, o número de transtornos mentais votados no Manual de Diagnóstico Psiquiátrico aumentou para 374. Com cada transtorno novo, os psiquiatras criam outra forma de defraudar o público.
If you have 27 ways to bill in the DSM, that's 27 ways to bill. If you have 300, that's 300 ways to bill. So you can pretty much find anyone walking on the street that could fit into a DSM somehow.
When you build insurance companies, you can't say the word. You've got to say a number. And they have numbers for the most ridiculous things. You know, like arguing with your mother or peeing in the bed.
Adolescent rebellion disorder is an official psychiatric diagnosis. Arithmetic learning disorder is an official psychiatric diagnosis. General anxiety disorder is a recent diagnosis.
The psychiatric industry takes advantage of that. They say, wow, we can get these things categorized and make it look scientific, so let's label everything. Now we have a label for it. We can put a coding. If you've ever seen a medical insurance form, everything has a code.
In DSM, it just looks like sort of some magical numbers. Of course, what we're talking about is reimbursement for mental health treatment as an illness.
The more types of codings, the more types of illnesses you can come up with, the more claims can be paid, and the more reasons for treatment, and the more reasons for revenue for the psychiatric establishment, for the hospitals, and of course, the pharmaceutical companies.
Por mais incrível que pareça, embora apresentem o DSM ao mundo como um facto científico, os psiquiatras admitem a sua falta total de ciência.
We have no diagnostic reliable markers for almost any illness there is in the DSM.
What we're testing for in psychiatry, it's hard to say because there's nothing specifically.
But as far as a test that's clinically useful, basically we're not there yet.
We don't have any laboratory tests that we can use to determine whether somebody does or doesn't have a mental illness.
There are no good biological tests for detecting mental illness.
There is no test, there's no biopsy you can do.
There is no chemical test right now.
There are no specific tests to confirm the diagnosis or show the improvement, like any blood tests or any x-rays or anything like that.
Oh, in my practice, I don't do any tests. I just speak with people and listen to them, and then I make a decision in what kind of illness.
Estes diagnósticos variam tanto quanto os psiquiatras que os dão. Nesta cena de câmara escondida, uma pessoa visitou vários psiquiatras queixando-se dos mesmos sintomas.
I'm extremely unorganized, and I didn't used to be. It's caused problems in the family. It's caused problems getting, I'm self-employed.
You got ADD, ADHD, and you're depressed, and your depression is bipolar depressed.
You have a brain chemistry disorder, and it's probably genetic.
You have a lot of the symptoms of depression.
So it seems like it is a mixed picture. What that means is like we got some depressive symptoms and some, high symptoms.
If you're bipolar, I'll need to give you a mood stabilizer. We don't know. I kind of doubt it.
It's considered low-grade bipolar.
You are more of the ADD and ADHD. And as far as medications for depression, because I would recommend that you start a medication, which are Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa.
Usually Focalin XR is pretty good.
They'll give you some Lexapro in the morning and some trazodone at night.
Lamictal is a better medication for that. It works on your depression also.
But the treatment for any bipolar cycling is the same. Lithium.
Remeron is another one.
Trazodone.
Tegretol. Depakote.
Wellbutrin.
Lexapro.
Lamictal.
Equatroid.
Depakote.
Lithium.
Ambien.
You may need an antidepressant also with your Lamictal.
We don't know if I give you a medication if it is going to work or not.
To a certain degree, it's trial and error.
You never know if it's the right drug.
How many people have I cured? Well, there are no real cures right now in psychiatry.
I have cured none of my patients.
We're always challenged by our lack of knowledge.
In fact, we don't know what the causes of mental illness are.
Most mental illnesses, we do not know the cause.
Of course, it would be nice to know exact reasons of disorders, but maybe in the future.
I'm the Director of Research at the American Psychiatric Association. We don't know the etiology of really any of the mental disorders at the present time.
DSM-5, it's grown to 10 times its original size, and it labels everybody. I could find 5 diagnoses that would fit you or anybody else in there.
Compare-o aos métodos de investigação patológica, uma ciência que descobre doenças reais usando vasto conjunto de exames diagnósticos.
We do millions of laboratory tests as well as the structural examination and the microscopic examination. It's a whole series of applied scientific procedures. In the case of psychiatry, there isn't any laboratory tool that can precisely identify psychiatric disease and allow it to be classified.
It's not as if there's some study of tissue or some study of the body or some study of matter. These are all categories which are made up. They're simply made up. They don't exist in nature. They're decided upon by psychiatrists and voted on.
Os psiquiatras não são os únicos que beneficiam do DSM. Onde se encontra um diagnóstico de psiquiatra, encontra-se psicotrópico.
The pharmaceutical corporations now contribute enormous sums of money for the education of psychiatric residents and for the support of research by their professors, so that psychiatry today has become in America, has become very largely learning of which drug to use with which disease or disorder.
This to me is completely unethical, untenable, unacceptable for this to occur. The web of money is all over the place. It has compromised psychiatry, and now it's compromising psychology, and worst of all, it's compromising the patients.
Em 2006, estudo revelou que 56% de todos os psiquiatras que decidiam quais transtornos deveriam ser listados no DSM tinham laços financeiros com laboratórios farmacêuticos. Hoje vemos as consequências. Uma quantidade enorme de drogas, cada uma para cada transtorno inventado que é respaldado por diagnóstico arbitrário encontrado no DSM.
The fact that it is couched in the language of science without necessarily having any of the scientific data or underpinnings to justify it is as threatening as anything we've seen today.
Qual é o estratagema mais recente e caro da psiquiatria para enganar o público, imitando a medicina legítima? Tomografias cerebrais.
We can scan all the brains we want to. The fact that we see changes in different people's brains, changes in functioning, doesn't mean that we've discovered anything that has its origin in the brain. It just means that we're seeing changes, but it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the brain.
They have no reliable measures about precise blood flow patterns for any of the psychiatric disorders using any of the scans.
It's marketing. This is marketing. This is not science. This is incredibly effective marketing. It has nothing to do with science.
Psiquiatras e psicólogos usam o DSM para rotular 450 milhões de pessoas mundialmente como doentes mentais. Um total igual às populações da França, Itália, Alemanha, Canadá, Reino Unido e Rússia combinadas. Enquanto as vendas de psicotrópicos chegaram a 84 mil milhões de dólares por ano, os fundos de governos mundiais para estes pacientes dão à psiquiatria um lucro de mais de 250 mil milhões de dólares por ano. E muito deste dinheiro vem do diagnóstico e medicação dos nossos entes queridos mais crédulos e vulneráveis.
We have swallowed all manner of poisonous certainties fed us by our parents and school teachers. If the race is to be freed from its crippling burden of good and evil, it must be psychiatrists who take the original responsibility.
A declaração de Brock Chisholm exemplifica o assalto psiquiátrico direcionado ao sistema educativo.
They actually said that the purpose was social control, not to pass on knowledge, not to give him something so that he can go into the world of work.
Em 1950, psiquiatras e psicólogos de todo o mundo reuniram-se na Casa Branca para propor uma reorientação total do sistema escolar público.
The White House Conference on Mental Health in the 1950s was a landmark that served to bolster the idea that schools would serve their communities better as mental health clinics than they would as institutions of learning.
In the early 60s, the world of psychiatry started to really go places in this country. Little by little, it came into our schools, our educational system.
E em 1965 foi escrito como lei. Os psiquiatras receberam carta branca para rotular e medicar as crianças nas escolas indiscriminadamente.
A child is labeled ADD or ADHD the minute he can't sit still for a 10-15 minute period of time, or he talks constantly, or ignores the teacher completely. That will get him and earn him an ADD or ADHD label.
A rotulação de transtorno de déficit de atenção e hiperatividade, TDAH, entrou em pleno uso em 1987. Dentro de um ano, 500 mil crianças estadunidenses foram diagnosticadas como tendo TDAH. Por volta de 1997, esse número subiu para 4,4 milhões. Em resposta ao vasto alarme público a esta aparente epidemia de doença mental, o governo dos Estados Unidos subsidiou institutos de saúde nacionais, reunindo médicos e psiquiatras conhecidos para explicar aos familiares e professores o que era o TDAH.
I would like any member of the panel to describe a typical ADHD in terms of symptomatology. Mark, would you like to? Since you see them in your practice.
I think the panel has been frank, and the difficulties here are immense in terms of these. It is hard. It's very hard to know how to answer this question. They cannot, even when. They are as if driven by a motive. There are some good clinical descriptions. And I think, I think part of the problem is the profession keeps changing the diagnosis.
At this time, we do not have a diagnostic test for ADHD. Therefore, the validity of the disorder continues to be a problem.
Mas esta admissão surpreendente não parou os psiquiatras escolares. 2 anos depois, o número de estudantes estadunidenses diagnosticados com TDAH disparou para 6 milhões. Hoje, 20 milhões de crianças no mundo são rotuladas com transtorno mental, um diagnóstico feito frequentemente em minutos.
We would sit behind a two-way mirror along with the parents. We would then look at the child. We would do small manipulative activities with them to see where their deficit was. It was wrong what we were doing. We were looking at a 5-minute glimpse of this child's life and saying, okay, here you go. Here's a little pill, take it, you'll be fine.
Esses pequenos comprimidos, como a Ritalina, Adderall e Concerta, são classificados pelo Departamento Antidrogas dos Estados Unidos como substâncias altamente viciantes, como a cocaína, ópio e metanfetaminas.
When I was on the Ritalin, it made me just feel totally different, like I wasn't even who I was.
I was, flipping out, was twitching, going crazy.
I felt like I was out of it all the time, like I wasn't there, I wasn't human.
You're just a zombie, pretty much. You do what you can just to get by and just don't do anything extra.
My mother never teased me, but she thought I really had ADHD and I was wrong, and I had something wrong with me. So I thought she'd feel bad and feel sorry for me if I died, but then again, I thought that she would miss me a lot, and I also love her a little more than I wanted to kill myself. And So I stopped when I realized that.
A abundância de prescrições criou uma nova fonte de rendimento às crianças, com a venda dos seus medicamentos aos seus colegas.
It's called kitty cocaine. They take the Ritalin and they just repackage it and they sell it on campus to the kids because it's like speed.
Hoje, quase 10% de todos os adolescentes estadunidenses, cerca de 2,1 milhões, abusam de Ritalina e outro estimulante psiquiátrico, o Adderall. E estas drogas podem levar também a substâncias ainda mais prejudiciais.
I figured, like, if I was gonna do drugs, I might as well make it worth it. And I ended up doing street drugs, and then I ended up getting into it really bad.
We're looking at marijuana and other things as being gateway drugs, and actually the so-called medications are a greater gateway drug.
The Ritalin drugs are backfiring big time because if the child is already disruptive and he takes cocaine, he's going to be a lot more disruptive after he's taken it. It is not going to calm him down.
Boom, she got on the drugs and her personality changed, her behaviors changed, they became erratic and dark and violent, and it was just a nightmare.
He kept having adverse reactions, becoming very, very angry. He could not control his behavior, he couldn't control his temper.
He was on 5 different psych meds, Prozac and lithium, and he was 7 years old. And he was unable to function. He would have rages and then crying and all kinds of just violent rages, grabbing knives and all of this.
The list includes 15-year-old Kip Kinkle withdrawing from Prozac when he shot 22 classmates, killing 2 after murdering his mother and stepfather at his home in Springfield, Oregon. 18-year-old Jason Hoffman on Effexor and Celexa when he opened fire at his California high school, wounding 5. 15-year-old Sean Cooper on a mix of antidepressants when he shot students in Idaho. And 17-year-old Eric Harris on Luvars when he and partner Dylan Klebold killed 12 classmates and a teacher in the bloodiest school massacre yet, Columbine.
Isto tudo encobre a verdadeira razão pela qual as crianças vieram para a escola em primeiro lugar. Para serem educadas. Desde 1970, os Estados Unidos caíram do 9º para o 23º lugar no ranking académico internacional. E durante esse período, o número de alunos rotulados com transtornos mentais, de aprendizagem e de comportamento disparou. E a venda de drogas de TDAH multiplicou-se por 310 vezes.
Children don't ask for psychiatric drugs. Children don't ask to be diagnosed. They don't want to be called crazy. So you ask the classic Roman question, legal question, cui bono, who benefits? The people who make the diagnosis.
Psychiatry should actually go into government, that politicians should listen to psychiatrists. Psychiatrists should be in every parliament and should direct and monitor political activities.
A psiquiatria, em pouco mais de um século, afetou negativamente a sociedade numa escala global. E não foi por acidente.
People aren't aware that in 1940, a prominent British psychiatrist, Colonel J.R. Rees, addressed the National Council on Mental Hygiene and set the agenda for psychiatry for the next 60 years. Since then, psychiatrists have been given authority in nearly every sector of our society, with tragic results.
We must aim to make it permeate every educational activity in our national life. Public life, politics, and industry should all of them be within our sphere of influence. We have made a useful attack upon a number of professions. The 2 easiest of them, naturally, are the teaching profession and the church. The most difficult are law and medicine.
Colega de Rees, o psiquiatra G. Brock Chisholm, cofundador da Federação Mundial de Saúde Mental, mais tarde expandiu os planos da psiquiatria.
To achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas.
Para implementar o seu plano, os psiquiatras convenceram o Congresso dos Estados Unidos de que as doenças mentais são uma ameaça que só eles, com um vasto aumento das verbas, poderiam resolver. E daí os Estados Unidos começaram a gastar quantias enormes em pesquisa psiquiátrica, que subiram de $1 milhão anuais em 1946 a 1,5 mil milhões de dólares hoje, um aumento em mais de 150.000%. A influência psiquiátrica espalhava-se pelos Estados Unidos e também pelo mundo. Por detrás de todas as crises mundiais, encontra-se a mão da psiquiatria. Por exemplo, o psiquiatra sérvio Jovan Raskovic, que exigiu a limpeza étnica dos croatas e muçulmanos porque ele acreditava firmemente na sua inferioridade racial. O resultado foi a Bósnia da década de 1990, onde o colega de Raskovic, o psiquiatra Radovan Karadzic, e o primeiro-ministro Milosevic criaram campos de concentração nos Balcãs, onde ocorreram a tortura, violação e assassínio em massa de inocentes. Um psiquiatra militar explicou como é que isto foi feito.
C'est très difficile tuer millions de personnes. C'est très difficile, techniquement difficile. Les Allemands étaient bons techniciens et ils ne pouvaient pas, ils pouvaient seulement 6 millions de Juifs exterminés. Ils massacrent, par exemple, 100 ou 200 de personnes, ou violent 100 femmes et 100 jeunes filles, pour que les autres sont effrayés et échappent. Alors vous avez le terrain pur.
Com o condicionamento de Pavlov em conjunto com as técnicas atuais do controle da mente e drogas, os psiquiatras e psicólogos podem transformar homens e até crianças em assassinos de massas.
You could train them to use firearms indiscriminately. You could train them to shoot people with very little feeling or thought. You could train them to use abusive and brutalizing procedures in order to obtain information with no hesitancy, with no concern.
Atos terroristas-chave foram influenciados desta forma. Depois do 11 de setembro, Osama Bin Laden foi caracterizado como mentor por trás dos ataques. Mas o conselheiro e comandante reconhecido da Al-Qaeda é Ayman al-Zawahiri, formado em Psicologia e Farmacologia na Universidade do Cairo e o autor do manual de treino da Al-Qaeda sobre o uso da psiquiatria coerciva. Ao orquestrar os atentados à bomba em Madrid, Abu Hafiza, outro agente da Al-Qaeda, confiou nestas mesmas técnicas para manipular as mentes dos homens.
You can implant memories. Memories are potent sources of motivated behavior. If you implant enough memories of specific kinds, you can shape and change the nature of human thinking and feelings.
And it was thought to be a kind of ultimate weapon because what greater weapon could there be than control of the human mind?
You can control minds and you can move people around, particularly when you control their lives. It's easier to control their minds.
When we look at psychiatry and psychology, social control is the primary agenda.
Essa agenda manifesta-se em todo o mundo agora mesmo, com campanhas para a saúde mental dadas ao público sob o nome inocente de questionários juvenis.
The national government is actually encouraging it and wanting to test every single kid in our public school system.
All children are put under this kind of a test for psychiatric evaluation, a 10-minute test that tells them absolutely nothing.
I predict that upwards of 90% of all the people screened will be diagnosed as having a psychiatric disorder, which means that we'll have an entire generation that will be a perfect profit center.
O homem por detrás desse programa é o psiquiatra David Schaffer, consultor do Departamento de Defesa dos Estados Unidos.
They're not just screening children to have complete control of the 52 million children in school. They're screening now, and they will screen their parents, and they will screen all adults in America.
The idea of mass screening for mental illness in the American population, run by a government initiative, is one of the scariest ideas I ever heard of.
Psychiatry is politics, has always been politics. It is politics pure and simple, because psychiatry was always the application of force against people who don't want to be forced.
It's a sad thing, and parents better wake up. Society better wake up, because we're in serious trouble if they don't.
Na década de 1940, os psiquiatras anunciaram a sua intenção de se infiltrar em toda a sociedade. Esta é a realidade agora. Não temos uma epidemia de doenças mentais, temos uma epidemia de psiquiatria e dos danos e matança em nome da saúde mental. Há algo que pode e deve ser feito.
Tonight's premise, are we pushing pills on our kids? They are on everything.
There are even kids in the system as young as 2 years old on the drugs.
Millions of Americans are taking mood-altering drugs.
An alarming increase in the number of people using antidepressants.
Dangerous side effects of antidepressants.
Drugs that have already killed nationwide.
There are over 200 suicides, 300 murders. Priests, new mothers, scholars, Iraq veterans, senior citizens, all dying violently. All were on antidepressants.
Em anos recentes, os tratamentos com psicotrópicos têm sido expostos cada vez mais como ineficientes, custosos e prejudiciais à saúde. Como consequência, a sua liderança luta para encontrar o seu próximo avanço milagroso. Mas devido à sua história, a psiquiatria é, como diz o ditado, pau que nasce torto nunca se endireita. Na primeira década do século XXI, o tratamento com psicotrópicos está a enfrentar problemas. Vários estudos confirmam agora que a classe de psicotrópicos mais tomada, os antidepressivos, não funciona melhor do que um placebo e carrega consigo efeitos secundários severos, tais como tensão arterial baixa, hemorragia interna, convulsões, psicose e suicídio. Outra classe de psicotrópicos, os antipsicóticos, cria obesidade grave, diabetes e doença cardíaca coronária. E outro tipo ainda, os estimulantes, pode causar arritmias cardíacas, atraso no crescimento e diminuição do cérebro. Mas os psiquiatras e os seus parceiros farmacêuticos têm uniformemente minimizado ou negado muitos destes riscos e em anos recentes têm pagado muito caro nos tribunais. Desde agosto de 2004 a janeiro de 2012, os laboratórios farmacêuticos pagaram mais de 10 mil milhões de dólares em multas e indemnizações envolvendo as drogas psiquiátricas. Isso tudo tem influenciado os 6 maiores laboratórios farmacêuticos a fecharem os seus laboratórios de pesquisa de psicotrópicos. Uma evolução que tem deixado a psiquiatria a tatear à procura de respostas.
For the last several decades, psychiatry has really been involved in what they call biopsychiatry, which is really trying to modulate behavior and emotions and thought based on altering brain chemicals. But now we have these large pharmaceutical companies that are saying they're not even going to research that area anymore, and increasing literature reports that these drugs don't even work and never did work.
Com uma ladainha de procedimentos vergonhosos e destrutivos e uma lista longa de baixas humanas, os psiquiatras continuam com o seu hábito desesperado de espalhar os seus tratamentos fracassados e perigosos e apresentá-los como grandes avanços.
The attention is now being put on direct physical and electrical applications to the brain. The biggest example of that, the one that there's most experience with, is electric shock. But there's all other variations on that, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, vagus nerve stimulation, deep brain stimulation, all different ways of applying electricity and magnetism to the brain.
No primeiro destes tratamentos experimentais psiquiátricos que estão hoje no mercado, a estimulação magnética transcraniana, os psiquiatras disparam ondas eletromagnéticas potentes diretamente ao cérebro. Os tratamentos de EMT atacam o cérebro com 3.000 impulsos eletromagnéticos por minuto durante 40 minutos de cada vez, 5 vezes por semana, durante 6 semanas. Tem um custo que gira em torno de $12.000. Não é barato, nem eficaz.
the best studies have shown that 70% of the time it's completely ineffective. When we look at that supposed 30% benefit rate, though, we've got to remember that about 20 to 25% of that is due to placebo.
There's no rational scientific way to justify invading your brain with damaging input in order to get the same response as placebo. Just take a placebo pill.
Além do seu índice absurdamente alto de fracasso, a estimulação magnética transcraniana causa enxaquecas, convulsões e induz ao suicídio. Isso é só a curto prazo. Os efeitos a longo prazo nunca foram estudados. Igualmente ineficaz e talvez mais perigosa é a chamada estimulação do nervo vago, um procedimento em que uma bateria implantada no peito envia impulsos elétricos a cada 5 minutos ao longo de um nervo muito importante.
It's like a pacemaker in your chest, attached to the vagus nerve that connects the brain to the heart. And you stimulate the vagus nerve, and for some reason that sends a signal up to your brain, which for some reason is supposed to jazz up your chemicals and affect your mood state.
It was developed first about 1966. They were doing it to treat high blood pressure. It didn't work, and so I guess they've been looking for something to do with it ever since.
Really, we have no idea really how it works, why it should work. It's not based in any real knowledge of medicine.
Um dos maiores defensores do método no mundo admite abertamente que não há nenhuma ciência por detrás da estimulação do nervo vago.
Fundamentally, we don't know how it treats depression. Fundamentally, we don't know what depression is in the brain. Unfortunately, we need a lot more science research about that. We do have ideas and theories, and we do know that.
Mesmo que o seu maior defensor admita que não sabe nada sobre o que está a fazer, os psiquiatras que fazem a estimulação do nervo vago ainda sujeitam os seus pacientes a efeitos como dor no pescoço, problemas respiratórios, dificuldades para engolir e problemas cardiovasculares fatais, sem falar no alto índice hediondo de fracasso e honorários que giram em torno de 10 mil a 25 mil dólares. Mas o tratamento psiquiátrico mais perigoso de todos é a estimulação cerebral profunda. Aqui, fios de metal são implantados profundamente no cérebro, que vai receber uma quantidade grande de choques elétricos contínuos provindos de uma bateria implantada na clavícula. A ECP, como também é conhecida, tem sido um trabalho em curso da psiquiatria desde o início da década de 1950, sob o comando do psiquiatra da CIA, Robert Heath, que fazia experiências com o controle comportamental humano. Um fracasso contínuo que os psiquiatras prepararam-se para usar novamente hoje como outra cura milagrosa.
Without a doubt, when you put an electrode in the brain and you constantly administer electricity, there is a physiological change that occurs on a continual basis. That's why this electrode is put in the brain. But we don't know what the effects are in the long run.
We know some of the shorter-term mental effects that happen relatively soon after the wire's been put in include personality changes, inability to have executive function, which means cannot make plans for the future, cannot make decisions for themselves, change in personality. Criminal behavior has been seen after implantation of a brain wire.
Mesmo os seus defensores confessam que a estimulação cerebral profunda é uma operação séria e potencialmente arriscada. E muito experimental, cujos efeitos secundários incluem infecção cerebral, insónia, delírio, hemorragia cerebral e um índice de suicídio que chega a ser 400 vezes maior.
These statistics for suicide with deep brain stimulation are the worst suicide rates that we've ever seen from any procedure or treatment or medication or operation of any kind that's ever been devised.
Apesar dos riscos ao paciente serem assustadores e profundos, a estimulação cerebral profunda é um negócio rentável para cirurgiões psiquiátricos, que amealham cerca de 30 mil dólares por operação.
You see, this is what concerns me about some of these new techniques, whether they're electrical or chemical. They still do not address the problems that cause the person to be depressed in the first place.
Mesmo com um fracasso chocante e uma lista horrível de efeitos secundários, psiquiatras e psicólogos, os mais proeminentes com laços financeiros fortes à indústria, estão contudo a dar os seus avais profissionais a este mercado de neuroestimulação, em que se estima que as receitas aumentem 20% ao ano.
It looks to me like it's just the same story going over and over and over and over. We had things we did in the 19th century, we had things we did in the 20th century, and if you go 100 years into the future, basically everything psychiatry is doing now will have disappeared and be dropped. It'll be something different. Is it ever going to become effective?
É claro que não. Porque quando se examinam os registros psiquiátricos, não faltam só respostas, mas é também um histórico longo de falsas alegações, traição pungente e um sofrimento humano desnecessário. Pode-se perguntar, então se a psiquiatria não funciona, custa muito dinheiro e causa danos aos seus pacientes, o que se deve fazer? Felizmente há respostas, mas estas estão fora do campo da psiquiatria. A primeira coisa a fazer é consultar um médico qualificado, não um psiquiatra, para fazer um exame médico completo.
When a person comes in and they're having some sort of problems with depression or some sort of mental illness type symptoms, most certainly the first thing I do is not send them to a psychiatrist, because there's underlying metabolic and organic things that are most likely going on that are contributing to this situation.
The reality is that there's an underlying condition that needs to be addressed. There's a cause, and by just covering up a symptom and changing body function, even though you're not feeling a symptom, the problem still exists, and you're only moving closer to something more serious and more dangerous while you're on that medication.
And from these objective findings on our physical exam and the objective findings on our laboratory or other testing that we've done, we can confirm a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis that's consistent with the patient's complaints.
Um estudo descobriu que 58% dos pacientes psiquiátricos sofriam de uma doença física subjacente. Uma doença médica real, mensurável, que pode ser detectada e confirmada com exames laboratoriais.
There is nothing to lose by looking at alternatives, whether that's behavioural management or dietary intervention, or perhaps looking at toxicity in the environment. Where is the problem with going along that route?
Do your own research. Don't just accept what a doctor says or what he offers you in the office.
Get informed. Know what's out there. Know what's going on. Watch some of the videos, read some of the literature, and determine for yourself what's true and what isn't.
Saber todos os factos por si mesmo e ser responsável pela sua saúde é a forma de assegurar o seu futuro bem-estar física e mentalmente. Pode-se ter a verdadeira saúde mental, mas somente sem os danos e tratamentos bárbaros da psiquiatria. Fundada em 1969 pela Igreja de Scientology, a Comissão dos Cidadãos para os Direitos Humanos investiga e expõe as violações dos direitos humanos feitas pela psiquiatria. Tudo começou com o caso de Victor Ghiori, internado compulsivamente no Hospital Psiquiátrico da Pensilvânia. O psiquiatra do hospital acusou Ghiori de balbuciar incoerentemente e rotulou-o de esquizofrénico paranoide. Mas Ghiori não estava louco. Ele estava a falar húngaro. A CCHR entrou com uma ação contra o hospital e o seu tratamento psiquiátrico abusivo. A sua defesa de Ghiori foi tão tenaz que no meio do caso o psiquiatra que dirigia o hospital levantou-se e disse: "Já não queremos saber nada mais sobre Victor Ghiori." Assegurar a libertação de Victor Ghiori foi o primeiro de milhares de casos defendidos pela CCHR.
CCHR challenged involuntary commitment laws throughout the United States and internationally. What we found were that people were being incarcerated without any legal rights.
They had no right to an attorney. They could be drugged, shot, lobotomized without their consent.
Por exemplo, na Austrália em 1977, onde a CCHR expôs uma prática psiquiátrica chamada tratamento de sono profundo.
Patients were being subjected to a cocktail of barbiturates and other psychiatric drugs. They were subjected to electroshock treatment daily, sometimes twice daily, without their knowledge. Deep sleep treatment caused 48 deaths.
Foi a CCHR que o investigou e expôs e lutou até que o tratamento de sono profundo fosse banido e as suas vítimas indemnizadas. Na África do Sul, a CCHR expôs os campos psiquiátricos, onde os pacientes mentais eram alojados, tratados brutalmente e escravizados. Na Itália, a CCHR trabalhou com os média e os legisladores e conduziu incursões nos hospitais psiquiátricos cujas condições eram bárbaras. A CCHR fechou o local e assegurou que os pacientes fossem encaminhados para cuidados apropriados. No Japão, a CCHR expôs o abuso de pacientes e crimes financeiros de psiquiatras e hospitais que defraudavam milhões do governo e dos contribuintes. Os culpados foram condenados por fraude e as proteções aos pacientes foram implementadas. E nos Estados Unidos, a CCHR revelou uma fraude de $1.000 milhões na maior cadeia de instalações de saúde mental privada do país. 600 agentes federais conduziram incursões em 20 estados. Seguiram-se dezenas de acusações, milhões de dólares em multas foram impostos e toda a cadeia de hospitais corruptos foi fechada permanentemente. E a lista continua até chegar a instalações na Austrália, França, Alemanha, Hungria e Reino Unido. A CCHR não só se assegura de que milhares de instalações psiquiátricas abusivas sejam fechadas, mas também que os direitos dos pacientes sejam restaurados. Por detrás de muitos avisos públicos sobre as drogas psiquiátricas está a CCHR. Tal como na Europa, onde a Agência Europeia de Medicamentos pôs rótulos nos antidepressivos, alertando para o risco de suicídio de crianças e jovens. Na África do Sul, onde o governo tem alertado os idosos que consideram tomar antipsicóticos sobre os riscos de derrame e ataque cardíaco. Nos Estados Unidos e México, onde, graças aos esforços da CCHR para promover o Decreto-Lei de Segurança de Medicação Infantil, os pais já não podem ser coagidos a dar psicotrópicos aos filhos para continuarem na escola.
CCHR has documented the side effects of these psychiatric drugs. It's taken evidence to the FDA, it's gone to Congress, and it's obtained congressional hearings.
CCHR was the first organization to expose that antidepressants could cause suicide and violence in patients. And due to CCHR's efforts, the FDA held hearings in 1991, but it would take the FDA a further 13 years before they finally issued black box warnings that antidepressants could cause suicide in patients.
No total, foram mais de 150 leis e mais do dobro de avisos oficiais em drogas, a salvaguardar para sempre o público dos perigos da indústria farmacêutica psiquiátrica.
People do have problems in life. Sometimes they're very serious, but the last thing you want to do is hurt them, and that's what psychiatric treatments do. There are treatments and methods that do work, that are helpful, without the violence of drugs and electroshock. But they cut across the vested interests that are making billions of dollars from psychiatric drugs every year.
History has shown that virtually every workable treatment, every one that has been available for the seriously mentally disturbed, people who actually need help, has been suppressed or shut down by the vested interests of psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry.
The public's largely been getting their information from the industry that benefits from putting them on psychiatric drugs. It's an advertising campaign. It's not science. It's marketing.
CCHR is causing things to change by being champions for a growing number of well-intentioned people who are risking their professional careers to speak up against the abuses of psychiatry.
Having that support from a group like this has made a tremendous difference in what I feel personally that I've been able to accomplish.
So I think of CCHR as fellow soldiers.
I'm unaware of any other organization that does the kind of work that CCHR does, particularly on the scope and the level that they do.
CCHR has been very effective at moving the ball down the field. One at a time, one state at a time, one legislator at a time.
CCHR has had the resources to be able to teach and have legislators become more aware of what the problem with the psychotropic drugs are.
CCHR has researched the issue. When you need the facts, you go to CCHR.
CCHR is the only body, by the way, that I've ever seen that actually has the backing to be able to stand up and do something, now anywhere in the world.
Hoje, a CCHR tem mais de 250 filiais em 30 países pelo mundo. A sua sede internacional, em Los Angeles, Califórnia, serve como uma central de informações, documentando as práticas invasivas e prejudiciais da psiquiatria e publicando as suas descobertas em 17 línguas. Mais de 12 milhões de exemplares foram distribuídos a profissionais de saúde, funcionários governamentais, professores e empresários em todo o mundo. A sede é o local da exibição mundialmente reconhecida Psiquiatria, uma indústria de morte. Centrada em torno de 14 documentários, esta exibição moderna apresenta a história da psiquiatria, das suas origens, onde os doentes mentais eram enjaulados como animais, à presente medicação em massa da sociedade como a cura para transtornos inventados. As versões ambulantes da exibição visitam centenas de cidades em 5 continentes, abrindo o caminho a centenas de milhares para descobrirem por eles mesmos a verdade por detrás da psiquiatria. A CCHR já produziu também uma série inteira de documentários premiados, expondo o abuso e o engano por detrás da fachada pseudocientífica da psiquiatria. Os documentários da CCHR e anúncios de serviço público apareceram na imprensa, na rádio e TV e na internet, informando milhões de pessoas com os factos sobre a psiquiatria e as drogas psicotrópicas. Por causa deste trabalho, prémios e reconhecimentos pelas realizações da CCHR vieram de governos e organizações de profissionais de todo o mundo. Onde e quando quer que os psiquiatras abusem dos direitos humanos, a CCHR transmite a sua mensagem. Dos Estados Unidos ao Japão e do Canadá ao Reino Unido, membros proeminentes da CCHR lideram marchas para assegurar a proteção para todos e libertá-los do abuso psiquiátrico.
You've got 1 million people being electroshocked every year, you have someone being involuntarily committed every 40 seconds, and you have 20 million children taking mind-altering drugs, and it's all under the guise of mental health.
The only way you're going to get humane treatment in the mental health system is to take psychiatry and its vested interests out of the picture. And only then will people be able to truly obtain mental health.
There's so many ways that people can get involved and help inform others. Our award-winning documentaries are available online, as are informational brochures. We have a psychiatric drug database where people can look up drug side effects for themselves, their loved ones. We have a very active social media network. It's all about getting informed, helping people make educated choices, and helping to spread the word.
You have 2 choices. Either you pretend you knew nothing about it, or you do something about it. With knowledge comes responsibility. That's why we're here. That's why people are joining forces with CCHR.
Milhares de pessoas de todas as fés e estilos de vida juntaram-se à CCHR para defender os direitos humanos contra o abuso psiquiátrico. É uma luta que irá continuar até que cessem as práticas abusivas e coercivas da psiquiatria e até que os direitos humanos e dignidade sejam devolvidos a todos. A sua ajuda é necessária. Junte-se a nós nesta luta.